The judge smiled before I even spoke. Not a warm smile. Not the kind that reassures you the system is working the way it should. It was the kind that says the conclusion has already been reached and the rest of the process is just paperwork. My father didn't look at me. He didn't need to. He'd already said enough. Your Honor, she's just a waitress. The words had landed clean, efficient, almost rehearsed. A few people in the gallery chuckled. Someone tried to hide it. Someone else didn't bother. I stood there, hands steady at my sides while $11 million and my name were reduced to an apron and a tray. The judge leaned back slightly, studying me like I was a case study, not a person. A waitress managing millions, he said, almost amused. And just like that, the room decided who I was. The courtroom wasn't large, but it felt crowded in the way small spaces do when people come expecting something to happen. Not chaos, not drama in the cinematic sense, something quieter, more controlled, a dismantling. Local attorneys filled the benches along with a handful of extended relatives who suddenly had opinions about a state law. Two neighbors sat in the back row, the kind who never spoke to you for years, but now leaned forward like they were watching something educational. My father sat in the second row, one arm resting casually along the back of the bench. He looked comfortable. That was the first thing I noticed when I walked in. Comfortable, like he'd come to confirm a decision, not argue for one. His attorney stood at the opposing table, already organizing a stack of printed exhibits, photos. I knew that before I saw them. The way he handled the folder, careful, deliberate, told me everything I needed to know about how this was going to unfold. On paper, the case was simple. My grandfather, Colonel Harlan Quaid, retired U.S. Army, had passed away 6 months earlier. His estate totaled just over $11 million. Real estate investment accounts, municipal bonds, nothing flashy, just disciplined accumulation over decades. He left the majority of it to me, his only granddaughter. My father received a smaller portion, not insignificant, but not equal. That imbalance was what brought us here. They weren't arguing about numbers. They were arguing about capacity. Your Honor, my father's attorney began, voice measured and practiced. We are not disputing the existence of the will. We are questioning whether the respondent possesses the financial judgment and stability required to manage an estate of this size. Stability. That word again. He turned toward the monitor beside the bench. With the court's permission, we would like to present visual evidence. The judge nodded once. The screen flickered to life. The first image filled it. Me behind the counter of a small cafe, navy apron, hair tied back, holding 2 coffee mugs. A timestamp sat in the corner. Late morning Tuesday. The room shifted slightly, not dramatically, just enough. The second image appeared. Me again wiping down a table, smiling at someone off camera. The third leaning over a register. The fourth carrying a tray to a customer seated by the window. They had angles, different days, consistency. These photographs, the attorney continued, were taken over a 3-week period. They demonstrate regular employment in a low-wage service position. Low wage. He didn't emphasize it. He didn't need to. Managing an estate valued at $11 million, he went on, requires financial sophistication, decision-making under pressure, and long-term planning capability. He paused just long enough for the implication to settle, attributes that are not typically associated with entry-level service employment. The judge leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on the bench. He looked at the screen, then at me. Miss Quaid, he said, are you currently employed at this establishment? Yes, Your Honor. A ripple moved through the gallery, subtle but there. And how long have you been working there? Approximately 3 weeks, he nodded slowly, tapping a pen against his notepad. And your income from this employment? Variable part-time. He wrote something down. Managing millions, he said almost conversationally, is a bit different from serving coffee. There it was, not aggressive, not hostile, just dismissive. A few people laughed, not loudly, not enough to be called out, just enough to register. My father didn't look at me. He was watching the judge. That part didn't surprise me. What surprised me was how familiar it felt. Not the courtroom, not the legal language, the tone, the quiet certainty, the assumption that the version of me they were seeing, the apron, the coffee, the small interactions was the whole story, that nothing existed beyond it worth considering. Your Honor, my father's attorney continued, we are requesting that the court consider appointing a temporary administrator for the estate pending further review. Given the respondent's current employment status, there is a reasonable concern regarding potential mismanagement. Mismanagement? The judge nodded again, slower this time. "Miss Quaid," he said, turning back to me. "Do you have legal representation today?" "I am representing myself, Your Honor." "Another shift, this one slightly sharper." "That is your right," he replied, "though I would strongly advise obtaining counsel given the complexity of the matter." Complexity. It was interesting how often that word appeared when people wanted to suggest you were out of your depth without saying it directly. My father's attorney resumed outlining their request in precise terms. Supervised control, financial oversight, psychological evaluation if necessary. Each point delivered calmly, reasonably, like a series of logical steps rather than an escalation. I didn't interrupt. I didn't object. I didn't correct a single assumption. When he finished, the judge folded his hands. "This court," he said, "needs assurance that the estate of Colonel Quaid is not placed in inexperienced hands." Inexperienced. The word hung there. I could feel the room waiting, not for evidence, not for argument, for me, for a reaction, for an explanation, for something that fit the version of the story they had already accepted. The girl in the apron, the $11 million, the mismatch. My father leaned back slightly, the faintest hint of a smile at the corner of his mouth. Not cruel, not overt, just confident, like someone who had finally found proof of something they'd believed for a long time. I reached down and picked up the folder I had brought with me. It wasn't thick. It didn't need to be. "Your Honor," I said evenly, "may I respond to the court's concerns regarding my capacity?" The room quieted. The judge nodded once. "Proceed." I stepped forward just enough to close the distance between where I had been standing and the edge of the bench. The monitor still showed me in that apron mid-motion, caught in a moment that now meant more than it should. For a second, just a second, I saw my grandfather standing in the doorway of his study, arms crossed, watching, not judging, not intervening, waiting. He never stepped in early. He always waited to see whether you would. I looked back at the judge. "Yes, Your Honor," I said, and for the first time since the hearing began, I allowed myself to speak. I didn't start with the documents. Not yet. Paper can wait. People don't. They decide faster than they read, and once they decide, it takes more than paperwork to move them. So I let the silence hold for a second longer than it needed to, long enough for the room to lean forward just a little. "My current employment," I said, "is temporary." My father's attorney shifted slightly, ready to object if I went too far too soon. "I understand how it appears," I continued. "I understand the concern." The judge watched me closely now, not amused, not convinced, just attentive. "What I don't believe," I added, "is that appearance alone is sufficient to determine capacity." There was a pause. A small one, the kind that tells you you've said something technically correct, but not yet persuasive. "Then help the court understand," the judge said. That was the opening. I didn't rush it. "Your Honor," I said, "if the court is evaluating my ability to manage my grandfather's estate, then context matters." He nodded once. "Go on. Context. It's a simple word, but it changes everything." I glanced briefly at the monitor. The image was still there. Of me in a navy apron carrying coffee like that was the most important thing I'd ever done. It wasn't wrong. It just wasn't complete. "My parents," I said, "dropped me off at my grandfather's house when I was 8 years old." The room shifted again, quieter this time. They called it an opportunity, a better environment. What it meant was simpler. I didn't look at my father. I was inconvenient. No one laughed at that. "My grandfather didn't ask how I felt," I continued. "He asked one question." I paused, hearing his voice in my head as clearly as if he was standing behind me. "Is this permanent?" The judge's pen stopped moving. They said no. It wasn't supposed to be. I let that settle for a moment. It was. I could see a few heads tilt slightly in the gallery, people adjusting the story. They thought they were watching. "Colonel Harlan Quaid believed in 3 things," I said. "Discipline, accountability, and earning your place in any room you enter." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. He gave me a schedule the first night I stayed in his house. Wake up at 5:30. Bed made by 5:35. Breakfast at 6:00. Reading at 6:30. A faint smile touched the corner of my mouth, not for the room, but for the memory. I thought it was extreme. I looked back at the judge. He told me I wanted structure. I just didn't know it yet. No reaction, but he was listening. There was no yelling in his house. No punishment in the way most people understand it, just consequences. I could feel the room settling into a different rhythm now. Less entertained, more attentive. If I forgot something, I corrected it. If I complained, He asked me a question. I let the silence stretch just enough to carry it. Is it illegal? A few people shifted in their seats. That was his standard, I said. Not whether something felt fair, whether it met the law. I rested my hand lightly on the folder in front of me, but didn't open it. By the time I was 12, I understood the difference between fairness and legality. By 14, I was reading basic contract law. The judge leaned back slightly, not interrupting. My parents visited occasionally, I continued. Holidays, birthdays, when it was convenient. They used words like serious and distant to describe me. I allowed myself a small breath. My grandfather called it focused. I didn't need to say more than that. When I was 16, I said I overheard a conversation in his office. My parents were asking him for early access to part of his investment portfolio. That got a reaction, subtle but real. He refused. I finally glanced in my father's direction just once. He told them, inheritance is not entitlement. I looked back at the judge. It's responsibility. The word hung there heavier than the others. I didn't understand how literal that would become until much later. The judge tapped his pen again, slower this time. And your professional background, Miss Quaid? He asked. There it was, the question they had avoided asking until now. I didn't answer it directly. After high school, I said I studied law. No elaboration, just the fact. I chose it because I value structure, systems, clarity. I could feel the attorney across from me shifting again, recalculating. After graduation, I continued. I entered the United States Army. That landed differently. Not dramatic, not explosive, just enough. A few people sat up straighter. I completed officer candidate school, I said, then continued my legal training through military channels. The judge's eyes narrowed slightly, focusing. And your current status? He asked. I met his gaze evenly. Active duty, Your Honor. The room went quiet. Not the kind of quiet that follows a joke, the kind that follows new information people weren't expecting to hear. My father's attorney stepped forward quickly. Your Honor, he said, while we respect the respondent's service, the issue before the court is estate management, not military. It is relevant, I said calmly, not raising my voice, just continuing. The judge held up a hand, not to silence me, to control the pace. Let her finish, he said. That was new. I nodded slightly. My current assignment status, I said, places me in a transitional period between postings. I gestured lightly toward the monitor. The cafe work you see here is part-time, temporary, lawful, no apology in it, no defensiveness. During this period, I am subject to standard compliance procedures related to financial oversight given the size of the estate and my active duty status. The attorney opened his mouth again, then closed it. Those procedures, I continued, include restrictions on direct management of certain assets until review is complete. The judge's pen moved again. So instead of sitting idle, I said I chose to work. I let that sit for a second. 3 shifts a week, cleaning tables, serving coffee. I looked back at the screen. It is not illegal. No one laughed this time. And it does not reflect my full professional capacity. The silence in the room felt different now. Not gone, just recalibrated. The judge leaned forward again, folding his hands. Miss Quaid, he said, do you have documentation supporting your statements? Yes, Your Honor. I tapped the folder lightly. Then we will review that, he said. But understand. He paused, choosing his words more carefully now. This court must evaluate not just credentials, but judgment. I nodded once. Of course, that word again. Judgment. It was always the last line they reached for when facts alone weren't enough. My father shifted in his seat behind me. I didn't turn around. He had built his case on what people could see. An apron, a tray, a series of photographs that told a simple story. What he hadn't accounted for, what he never had, was that I had been trained for most of my life to let people commit fully to their assumptions before correcting them. My grandfather used to say it all the time. If someone is going to underestimate you, he told me once standing in the doorway of his study, let them do it completely. I rested my hand flat on the folder. They'll argue their own case for you. I looked back at the judge. I'm ready to present my documentation, Your Honor. And this time, when I stepped forward, I wasn't closing distance. I was taking control of it. I didn't open the folder right away. That was deliberate. Paper changes outcomes, but timing changes people. And in a room like this, people mattered more than exhibits. Jurisdictions don't just run on statutes. They run on perception, on confidence, on the quiet belief that the person speaking knows exactly where they're going. So I let the moment sit. The judge was watching me now with a different kind of attention. Not dismissive, not convinced either, just recalibrating. My father's attorney stood with one hand resting lightly on the table, waiting for me to make a mistake or a leap or anything he could interrupt. I gave him nothing. Before I submit documentation, I said I'd like to address the evidence presented. The judge nodded. Proceed. I turned slightly, not toward my father, not fully toward the screen, but enough to acknowledge both. The photographs shown to the court are accurate, I said. They depict me working at a cafe over a 3-week period. No denial, no evasion, just confirmation. And the conclusion drawn from those images, I continued, is that I lack the capacity to manage my grandfather's estate. I let the implication hang. That conclusion, I said evenly, is incomplete. My father's attorney stepped forward just enough to signal objection without voicing it yet. He was waiting for me to overreach, to editorialize, to say something that sounded emotional instead of precise. I didn't. The court has been presented with a pattern, I said. Regular employment, routine shifts, repetition. I gestured lightly toward the monitor. A consistent narrative. The judge glanced at the screen again, then back at me. What has not been presented, I added, is the method used to construct that narrative. There it was. A shift. Subtle but real, explained, the judge said. I inclined my head slightly. The images were taken over a defined period, I said. 3 weeks, specific times of day, specific days of the week. I paused, letting the structure of that sink in. Mornings, early afternoons, never evenings. The attorney's posture changed just a fraction. Those time windows I continued to align with my off-duty hours during a transitional assignment period. No one spoke outside those windows. I said no surveillance was conducted. That landed. The judge's pen stopped again. You're suggesting selective documentation, he said. I'm stating a fact, I replied. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't emphasize it. I just let it exist. My father's attorney stepped in quickly. Your Honor, the respondent is speculating about investigative methods. I'm not speculating, I said. Still calm. I'm describing observable gaps. The judge lifted a hand again. Not sharply. Just enough. Let her finish. The attorney stepped back. That was the second time. I continued. If the goal was to assess my full professional capacity, I said the investigation would have extended beyond 3 weeks. It would have included verification of credentials, employment history, and licensing. I let my gaze settle briefly on the attorney. It did not. He held my look for a second, then looked away first. Instead, I continued. The court has been presented with a curated set of images that support a specific conclusion. I turned slightly more toward the judge. That I am a waitress. The word didn't carry weight the way it had before. Not anymore. Silence filled the room again. But it wasn't empty this time. It was active. People were thinking, reassembling. Your Honor, I said I'd like to submit Exhibit A. I opened the folder. The sound was small, but in that room it carried. I removed a single document and handed it to the bailiff, who passed it up to the bench. The judge looked down. What am I looking at? He asked. My active duty orders, I said. United States Army. He scanned the page slowly this time. And Exhibit B, I added, already pulling the next document free. This one moved through the same process. My legal certification, I said. Bar admission. The attorney shifted again, more noticeably now. Exhibit C, I said, placing the third document forward. Current assignment designation. The judge's expression didn't change dramatically. It didn't need to. The change was in the pace of his reading. Slower, more deliberate, less assumption. Your Honor, the attorney said carefully, we do not dispute that the respondent may have additional qualifications. Our concern remains her current pattern, I said quietly, finishing the sentence for him. He stopped. That's the word we keep coming back to, I continued. Pattern. I let the word settle between us. A pattern constructed from a narrow set of observations. The judge looked up at me again. And your explanation for this pattern? He asked. I met his gaze. It's incomplete. That was it. No elaboration, no justification, just the correction. The room held still. My father shifted behind me. This time I felt it, not saw it. A small movement, uneasy. The first sign that the version of the story he had relied on might not hold. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. Your Honor, I said, I understand the court's responsibility to ensure that my grandfather's estate is managed competently. I meant that. I share that responsibility. That part mattered more than anything else I had said. This is not about pride, I added, or perception. I rested my hand lightly on the remaining documents in the folder. It's about accuracy. The judge nodded once. Not agreement, acknowledgement. Continue, he said. I took a breath. Not deep, not dramatic, just enough. My grandfather did not make impulsive decisions, I said. He evaluated, he verified, he tested. I could see him again standing at the edge of the driveway, watching me struggle to carry something that was just slightly too heavy. He never stepped in immediately. He left me his estate. I continued because I met his standards. I let that sit, not because I asked for it. The difference mattered. My father's attorney stepped forward again, more carefully this time. Your Honor, the respondent is attempting to reframe the issue. The court is not evaluating her grandfather's intent, but her present capability, which is precisely what I'm addressing, I said. Still calm, still controlled. The judge raised a hand again. I understand both positions, he said. Proceed, Miss Quaid. That was the third time. Patterns were shifting. I nodded. My present capability, I said, is not defined by a 3-week snapshot. I looked once more at the screen, then back to the bench. It is defined by a body of work, training, and accountability that has not yet been fully presented to this court. I paused, and I intend to present it. The room didn't react outwardly, but the energy had changed. It was no longer about proving I was unqualified. It was about discovering whether I wasn't. That difference is where cases turn. I closed the folder gently, not because I was finished, but because I had said enough for now. My grandfather used to say, there's a moment in every argument where pushing harder weakens your position. This wasn't the moment to push. This was the moment to let them catch up. I stepped back slightly, returning to where I had been standing before. The distance felt different now. Not smaller, just balanced. The judge looked down at the documents again, then back up at me. Miss Quaid, he said, the court will take a brief recess to review these materials. He tapped the bench lightly. We will reconvene shortly. The bailiff called it out. People stood, chairs shifted, voices returned low and controlled. I stayed where I was for a second longer than necessary. Then I turned. My father was already looking at me, not smiling this time, just calculating. That was fine. He was a little late to start. The courtroom felt different after the recess. Not quieter, just tighter. Conversations dropped as people returned to their seats like a room adjusting to a new temperature. The judge came back in with a folder in his hand, not the same one from before. Mine. He set it down carefully, not casually. That was the first signal. Be seated. Chairs settled. The bailiff stepped back. My father's attorney straightened his tie, a small habit that hadn't shown up earlier in the morning. The judge looked at me first this time. Miss Quaid, he said, we've reviewed your submissions. He didn't say what he thought of them. Judges rarely do not directly, but the pause that followed carried more weight than any statement could have. Counsel, he added, turning to my father's attorney, you may proceed. The attorney nodded, but there was a fraction of a delay, just enough to register. Thank you, Your Honor. He stepped forward, but he didn't look at the screen this time. He looked at me. Miss Quaid, he said, you've provided documentation indicating military service and legal training. Correct. And yet, he continued, the concern remains your present judgment. Your decision to work in a low-wage environment while responsible for an estate of this magnitude raises questions. There it was again. Same argument, different angle. Questions, I repeated. Yes, he said, about priorities, about stability, about whether your actions reflect the level of discretion required. He was careful, more careful than before. That's a fair concern, I said. The admission caught him off guard. Not enough to show it, but enough to shift his stance. And your response? He asked. I didn't answer immediately. I let the room hold it. My response, I said, is that you're evaluating a decision without understanding the constraints under which it was made. The judge leaned forward slightly. Explain. I stepped forward again, just enough to close the distance I had created earlier. My current assignment, I said, places me under specific financial compliance protocols. The attorney frowned slightly. Those protocols, I continued, limit direct engagement with certain categories of assets during transitional periods between postings. The judge glanced down at the documents again, flipping one page. And your point? He asked. My point, I said, is that I am not currently managing the estate in full capacity by design, not by deficiency. That landed differently. The attorney recovered quickly. Even so, he said, choosing to work in a cafe is lawful, I said. Yes, he conceded, but it raises questions about judgment. Only if you assume there were better options available under those constraints, I replied. Silence. He didn't have a follow-up ready. The judge looked between us. "Miss Quaid," he said, "this court is less concerned with what is permissible and more concerned with what is prudent." I nodded. Understood that word again, but this time it wasn't a bridge. It was a setup. "Then help the court understand your decision-making process," he said. There it was, the question behind all the others. I let a second pass, not for effect, for clarity. "My decision," I said, "was to remain active, accountable, and visible during a period where my direct involvement in the estate was limited. I kept my voice steady. I chose work that required consistency, attention to detail, and public interaction." The attorney shifted again, preparing to push back. "Serving coffee," he said, unable to keep a slight edge out of it, "is not typically considered a demonstration of high-level financial judgment." I turned my head slightly toward him. "No," I said calmly, "it isn't." Then I looked back at the judge. "But it is a demonstration of discipline." That word again, the same one my grandfather used. "And discipline," I added, "is transferable." The judge didn't interrupt. He was listening now, not evaluating. Listening. My grandfather didn't leave me his estate because of what I did in a single moment. I said he left it to me because of how I operate consistently. I paused, letting that connect. Under pressure, under scrutiny, under constraint. I could feel the room leaning in again, not for drama, for resolution. "And today," I continued, "this court is evaluating me under all three." The attorney stepped in, trying to regain control. "Your Honor, the respondent is making generalized statements. I'm making specific ones," I said, not raising my voice, just continuing, "and I can support them." The judge raised a hand again, this time more decisively. "Let her finish." That was the fourth time. Patterns don't just shift, they settle. I took one more step forward. Not aggressive, not hesitant, just precise. "I understand the court's concern about perception," I said. I glanced once at the screen, still frozen on that image of me in the cafe. I understand why these images were persuasive. I looked back at the judge. They were meant to be. The room stilled. My father's attorney didn't move. My father didn't either. "They present a version of me that is easy to categorize," I continued, "easy to dismiss. I let the words land, but they are not false. That mattered. They are incomplete, and that mattered more." The judge leaned back slightly, studying me again. "Miss Quaid," he said, "you've established that the court may not have had the full picture." He paused, "but the question remains." He stopped just for a second, long enough to choose his words. "Who are you in this context?" There it was, not a legal question, a defining one. The room went still, no shifting, no whispering, just space. I didn't rush it. I didn't look at my father. I didn't look at the attorney. I looked at the judge, and I answered, "I'm not just a waitress." I let the sentence end there, not as a correction, as a transition. The silence deepened, measured, focused. "I'm a captain in the United States Army. No emphasis, no theatrics, just the truth." It landed like something heavy being set down carefully, not dropped, placed. No one laughed, no one moved. Even the attorney didn't speak. The judge didn't react immediately. That was what made it real. He didn't perform surprise. He absorbed it. Then he looked down at the documents again, slower this time. "Captain," he repeated almost under his breath. The room held. I didn't add anything. I didn't need to, because that wasn't the end of the answer. It was the part they could hear. What mattered was what came next. And this time when I spoke, I didn't step forward. I stayed exactly where I was. "I serve as a judge advocate, general officer," I said. The words were precise, clear. "I am licensed to practice law." A pause. "I operate under a chain of command that holds me accountable for decisions with legal and financial implications." Another pause. "My work requires discretion, analysis, and adherence to standards that are not optional." The judge's pen hadn't moved. He wasn't writing anymore. He was listening. I did not present this earlier. I continued because the court had not asked the right question. I let that sit, but now it has. Silence. Full, complete, irreversible. My father shifted behind me. Not a calculated movement this time. A reaction. Late. The judge placed the pen down. "Counsel," he said, without looking away from me. "Approach." The attorney hesitated for the first time. Then he stepped forward. The judge leaned slightly toward him, voice low but not low enough to hide the change. "We will need to revisit the basis of your argument." The attorney nodded carefully because the case hadn't ended. but the version of it they walked in with had. And there's a difference between losing a case and losing the story that was supposed to win it. The second hearing didn't feel like a continuation. It felt like a correction. Same room, same bench, same case number printed at the top of every document. But the energy had shifted into something quieter, more precise. There were fewer people in the gallery this time. No neighbors, no distant relatives leaning forward for entertainment. Just attorneys, a clerk, the bailiff, and my father. No one was smiling. The judge entered without looking at either of us. He sat, adjusted the file in front of him, and spoke without preamble. This court has reviewed the additional materials submitted. No commentary, no tone, just fact. Counsel, he said, turning to my father's attorney, you may proceed. The attorney stood slower than before, but composed. Your Honor, he began, we acknowledge the respondent's military service and legal qualifications. However, our concern remains. He stopped, not because he forgot his line, because it didn't fit anymore. He recalibrated mid-sentence. Our concern remains whether the decedent's decision was influenced by factors not fully understood at the time. Influence. It was a softer word than incapacity, less direct, more survivable. The judge nodded slightly. And your evidence? The attorney hesitated for half a second, then continued. We believe Colonel Quaid may not have fully appreciated the demands of managing an estate of this size in conjunction with active duty service. May not have. The language had changed. So had the footing. The judge turned to me. Miss Quaid. I stood. No folder this time. Everything that needed to be submitted already had been. What the court is being asked to consider, I said, is whether my grandfather made a decision he didn't understand. I let the weight of that settle. Colonel Harlan Quaid served 31 years in the United States Army. No one interrupted. He managed personnel, resources, budgets that exceeded anything in this room. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. He reviewed his estate annually. Every asset, every allocation. I paused just long enough. He knew exactly what he was doing. The judge's expression didn't change, but his pen moved again. Not quickly, not mechanically, deliberately. Do you have documentation of those reviews, he asked. Yes, Your Honor. I didn't reach for anything. They are already part of the submitted exhibits. He nodded once. The attorney shifted again, trying to find a way back in. Your Honor, he said, even if we accept that the decedent was aware of his decisions, the respondent's current circumstances are governed by regulation. I said. He stopped. The judge looked between us. Clarify, he said. My current assignment, I continued, places temporary limitations on direct asset management. Those limitations are documented, lawful, and designed to prevent conflict of interest. I let that settle. They do not indicate incapacity. The attorney opened his mouth, then closed it again because there was nowhere for that argument to go. The judge leaned back slightly. This court, he said, is not in the business of rewriting wills based on speculation. The word landed clean. Speculation. He looked at my father's attorney. You have not demonstrated undue influence. A pause. You have not demonstrated incapacity. Another pause. And you have not demonstrated mismanagement. 3 lines, 3 closures. The attorney nodded once slowly. Because there wasn't anything else to do. The judge turned to me. Miss Quaid, he said, the petition to appoint a temporary administrator is denied. He didn't look at the gallery. There was no gallery to perform for. The estate will remain under your authority, subject to the existing regulatory framework. I nodded once. Thank you, Your Honor. He made a final note, then closed the file. This matter is concluded. The gavel didn't come down hard. It didn't need to. The sound was small, final. People stood, chairs moved, papers gathered. No one rushed out. No one lingered either. The room emptied the way it had filled quietly. I didn't move right away. I waited until the clerk finished organizing the bench, until the bailiff stepped aside, until the last attorney walked through the door. Then I turned. My father was still there. He hadn't moved. For a second, we just stood across from each other, the same distance we'd had at the start of the first hearing. Different context, same space. You didn't have to do this, he said. Not loud, not angry, just stated. I considered that. There are answers you prepare for, and there are answers you don't need to. I didn't, I said. I held his gaze. You did? No emphasis, no accusation, just alignment. He looked at me for a moment longer, like he was trying to find something in my face that would make the outcome make sense. Then he nodded once. Not agreement, acknowledgement, and turned away. I watched him walk out of the courtroom the same way I had watched him sit in it without calling after him. without adding anything that didn't need to be said, because there wasn't anything left to argue. Outside, the air felt different, not lighter, just clearer. I stood on the steps for a moment, letting the noise of the street settle into something familiar. Cars passing, doors opening, people moving through their own versions of the day, unaware of what had just happened inside that building. That's the thing about moments like this. They feel enormous when you're in them, and invisible when you're not. I reached into my bag and pulled out my phone, not to check anything urgent, just a habit. There was a message from my unit. Assignment details. Next location. A new set of responsibilities already waiting. I read it once, then locked the screen. My grandfather used to say the same thing every time something ended. Good, he'd say. Now, what's next? I stepped down from the courthouse steps and into the street. Not faster, not slower, just forward, because that's all any of this ever was. Not revenge, not victory, just correction and continuation. If you've ever been underestimated, if someone decided who you were before you had the chance to speak, I'd like to know what you did next. Did you argue? Did you walk away? Or did you wait until the right moment to let the truth do the work for you? Leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Stories like this aren't rare. They're just rarely told all the way through. And if this one meant something to you, there are more waiting. Subscribe, stay with me, and let's keep going together.